So no, I thought it'd just be funny, really, from the fact that I do use RPE. I have used reps and reserve maybe once in a million years, but I only use RPE generally for assistance exercises. I think it touches upon what Dean was saying with regards to what does the athlete enjoy, and if they're a weightlifter, they never really enjoy the assistance work.
I like the
anyway.
assistance work.
Of course you do. But yeah, it's a bit like, at least whether they like it or they don't like it, I think psychologically they need to be committed and focused on the Olympic lifts. So that's really where I don't really want them to budge on feeling like, I feel it's a bit hard. Maybe, he said 7 out of 10, so I'll take it easy. I want them to mentally spend their vouchers on the full lifts, and then the assistance work to kind of have that play on the RPE side of things.
Yeah, I like that. Gives a bit more control.
Agree to Christian there, definitely. And I think another thing to note for the group is, like we mentioned earlier, especially from a novice perspective, having, and this is not just with weightlifting or powerlifting, but when we talk about compound and accessory-based movements, with beginners and novice lifters, RPE may hold some value to some degree, because we may not have developed the fundamental movement patterns that have allowed us to test and prescribe percentages. So that may be where that RPE could be useful. But like Christian said, and I'm sure Chris will elaborate more, but I don't know if RPE holds its value when you start getting more serious into sports or more serious into performance-based measures. I just think it's a little bit of a difficult topic.
So to me, I look at RPE as a form of auto-regulation, i.e. how they feel on the day. You can use that as a scale. But even then, well, why, if you're going to go on how they feel on the day, bar speed, whatever, how they look, technique, then you just reduce the load accordingly to get the effect of the goal for that training session.
Cool. So you've pretty much come round to pretty much how I prescribe. I will prescribe off a max, so triples at 80%, done. But I will certainly, the athletes that I know I can trust to make good choices, and there are athletes clearly that everyone will have worked with, those that are coaches, that they probably can't trust to make good decisions. I know there's a few of mine giggling right now. So you've got three sets of 3 at 80%. But movement must be perfect. So I will go lift as near to that percentage as you can for perfect form. If your form is jeopardized, then you sit down, because you're then, as Gary, you quite rightly said, you're kind of auto-regulating naturally there. So you don't need to put an RPE to it. You just make a good choice. I don't want to be kind of a little bit airy-fairy, but one of my ethos with Crazy Strength is being a good human, doing the right thing at the right time and all that sort of stuff. So making good choices at the right time is about being a good human and being a good athlete. So if you know that, and Christian knows I'm the worst at this, because if he tells me 80%, I'm probably going to do 85% because I am old and I'm a dickhead. But that doesn't mean to say that that's not what I believe is the right thing to do. Don't nod your head, Dean.
Me too. I do that too.
Just agree with the second comment. Sorry.
Oh, shots fired. But
shots fired.
I will. Who's that? Sorry, go again.
Oh, me? Yeah, I said I'd do the same as well.
When Christian programs it?
Yeah, I put it up. Chris already knows that, so that's fine.
So yeah, that's kind of the way that I tend to go. You're probably then the same as me, in that I should probably listen to myself a little bit more and probably not chase the number so much. And I will give an inkling in a minute as to kind of something that I'm off program. If I haven't told Christian that, I am doing a bit of barbell velocity stuff this week, rather than running a Smolov squat program, which is probably not the best idea for me. But I will then look to go and share my screen with you again for the next effort, which is this bad boy. So this one is Prilipin's chart, which I know most people are aware of. There's a lot of things that are going around that are using this to prescribe. Who's that in the background with the... There we go. Cool. So the top one is Philippines chart specific to powerlifting. The bottom one, Medvedev adapted for weightlifting. So those two are kind of specific. Philippines chart in the top there was derived from the 70s, I think. Christian, correct me if I'm wrong. Your research is probably better than mine with that side of things. Yeah, seen a nod, so I'm happy. And then Medvedev in the 80s kind of looked to change that. I think it's quite nice to see that there is and one of the things I like to look at when I prescribe squats is looking at your minimum effective dose. So we have things like German volume training, which are great, but they absolutely destroy people. There is a really good range, and there's lots of science behind looking at, but I know Christian's laughing because HGVT and small are probably in the same categories. But the prescriptions of having optimal against percentages, total rep ranges, and what sets and reps you could use are quite nice. The main thing I've kind of put this up is actually to bear in mind that a lot of this research has been done within the Soviet Union and Russia. So I would take those percentages with probably a pinch of salt. They're fairly close, but don't be surprised if you still struggle a little bit to stay with that if you run that in an undulating program through a period of time. And that's the only real reason I've kind of put that one up. The last one I have.
Craig.
Yes.
I was going to say on that RPE thing.
Do you want it back?
No, I think you. I think we need to hear Chris's views, because I think Chris could incite some pretty.
Of course,
useful.
he was around in the 70s, wasn't he?
That's it. He will know. So hopefully Chris can push some wisdom onto us.
Chris, talk us about when you first saw this.
I've got to be honest, I don't use RPE as a personal point of view. I've used RPE in endurance-based training in the military, where you've not got heart rate, for instance, where you're using recruits who might not have any experience of training, and then you're just asking them how they're feeling on that scale of 1 to 10. It's quite easy. Personal thoughts, I've not used it in weightlifting, and it's a personal thing. I think there's loads of different tools we can use. I just don't see the relevance a lot of the time. If we've got someone who's so new to training, they don't know what they're training at. They don't know what level they're going to feel or what they're exerted at. As with, novice trainers, they don't know what their PB is. We might not know what their 1 rep max is for 18 months, 2 years. So again, everything works for novices, doesn't it? That's the biggest thing I've seen in my sort of full time. Everything works for the novice. Every stimulus is going to have an effect.
I think that was one of the big points. Sorry to cut you in there, Chris. In that a lot of people will start jumping on really crazy, fancy programming. Bestie, your dog is so cool. Sorry, Chris. In that, for most people, linear programming will suit most novices done well or periodized properly for a good 2 years. And actually, you don't need to come off of linear programming until you start to see that progress kind of slow, and then some kind of change of stimulus needs to happen, be it the different undulating programs and then conjugate systems and that sort of things. But carry on, Chris. Sorry.
No, that was literally it. I think programming is overcomplicated a lot of the time by novices, and people looking for an ultimate solution by printing something off the internet and going, "No, that's the DS solution. That's the answer." Right?
New thing.
You find a lot of the old school coaches, especially in the UK, generally follow a very basic system, a proven system. They're not coming out with crazy ideas. Cyril Martin, Andy Callard, Ray Williams, I know Christian's long-term coach, they've all got very basic but very sound ideas.
They're concrete, aren't they, really? Because they keep it simple and stupid, and it makes so much sense because it's easy to follow, easy to adhere to, and it's works.
Focus on the technical movement.
Exactly, consistently shown to work.
Perfect. In which case, I will stop sharing that one and bring up to my last slide, which is this one. Cool. So, strength, speed, continuum. The reason I wanted to actually pull this one up is more for the lockdown side of things, in that a lot of people are panicking that they're going to lose gains. What we probably find actually is that a lot of us are spending a lot of our time within the absolute strength, circa max strength, maybe touching on the accelerated strength side of things. We're not spending any of our time. I know I don't spend enough time, and Christian, don't laugh, in the speed strength and starting strength side of things. I'm naturally quite a fast twitch human. I've lost that because I've spent my time doing too much squats and not enough explosive stuff. So actually what we can get people doing is doing more plyometric stuff, doing more sprint work, which is probably stuff that's missing out in people's programs when they're in the gym and they're focused on only moving barbell stuff. It's probably stuff that actually, when you go back to the barbell, it's stuff that you should be keeping in and paying more attention to, because from a bigger picture strength, you're going to get more bang for your buck. And you're probably going to overtrain less, because the amount of recovery it takes to recover from something that is fast and sharp is going to be much less than it is if it is absolute strength side of things. I mentioned earlier that this last couple of weeks I have moved on to, I've got a Gucci bit of kit which enables me to track bar path, or not bar path, but bar speed and things like that. So I am training 4 sessions a week, but 2 of them will be absolute strength and strength speeds. The other one will be circa max and speed strength. And actually for me, even in the experience that I have, it was really interesting that to get a feel for what actually speed strength was. Speed strength is jump squats. It's not just moving a squat fast. It is jump squats. And I can't hit that 1, 2. I had, thanks, Christian. Christian, you raise your hand because you want to say something? Shall I put it? You can unmute if you want, mate.
Christian has been doing some pretty good speed strength exercises in his garden, I must admit.
Christian's really cool stuff. Do you want to add to that, Christian?
I was just going to jump back to one. We've got Aaron in here as well, who's quite a well-versed coach as well from the
Fit Performance, I think, Aaron.
Yes, he just noted a point in the chat about using, say, percentages for the Olympic lifts, and then like an RPE scale for, say, pulls and squats. I think it just raises a good point with regards to priorities in coaching for weightlifting, because obviously the squats and the pulls are just assistance exercises for us, and certain lifters have that speed breakdown and just general endurance throughout the session. You know, like taller lifters really struggle to hit the squats after snatch, clean and jerk. So top lifters like Redon Manouchi is quite a lanky guy. He would never ever squat and pull in the same session due to the breakdown over time. So I think that really raises questions of certain points. But I think your suggestion of, you know, having that buffer space margin where you're aiming for this 3/3s, for example, at 80%, but then having that there. But I did just write a whole article on VBT, on velocity-based training. But
I'm finishing my dissertation on it. We need to Zoom that.
But I think we're moving to a point where, in terms of tracking bar speed, the ability to write programs based on that. But obviously we do have issues with say, I'm sure you've done in your dissertation, the taller the lifter, the faster the bar has to go. So, we do struggle with regards to how easy it is and how individualized. I think it ends up becoming quite something I'd use for the elite guys with the equipment. But I think it's a really interesting time of auto-regulation. I think I'd be very interested to go more over that. But
I think that's another Zoom session on its own, is it not?
Yeah, it sounds like Christian's volunteering to jump on that one and give us.
I look forward to it.
I think the interesting thing that I found is that from an auto-regulation or from a controlled regulation with the bar speed velocity, is that certainly for me, and I've already covered the fact that I predominantly like to load up my bar, as I know a couple of others within here probably do as well. It kind of manages my expectations more. I'm not chasing what's on the bar. I am more interested in the speed that I'm moving the bar, knowing that the speed that I move that bar dictates what stimulus I'm providing that muscle. And actually my technical proficiency is much better. I know Christian's about to say something, so I'll let him go. And then
I was just going to say that for me, it's the flip side. So I'll be grinding out some squats thinking these are the hardest things I've ever done. Then I'll be able to check actually the mean speed is actually quite favorable this week. So I'm actually completely sandbagging, but because no one's coaching me, I'm by myself.
So you're quite negative on how it feels.
Yeah, I think especially things like squats when you feel awful. So I think it's very good to really work out whether you're cheating yourself or not.
I suppose it gives you an idea of actually what's happening, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly, and especially with, you might feel fantastic on the snatch, for example. I put numbers forward for certain lifters. For example, Omar one day was snatching 130, I think, and it was right on the edge of the kind of meters a second where I don't really want it to drop. So I think it was probably around 0.8 or something like that. And you can usually tell by the bar speed that just adding on 5 kilos, he'll miss it. Even though he felt 130 was perfect, because he's that guy, he never listened to me and he put the weight on and missed it, which, generally it looks
interesting.
fatigued.
Yeah, interesting that. I think there's probably a couple of things to bring out from the barbell velocity side of things. In that, cost-wise, the cheapest model that you're kind of looking at is probably the one I've got, which is about 400 quid. It's not cheap. They're great. They're really good tools, but you're looking at it as a club asset rather than an athlete asset, I believe. The other thing I find is that if you give it to someone who hasn't yet crafted their sport, the movement is more of an issue. So you'll have people, instead of chasing the kilos, they'll start chasing the speed, and then you'll find technique goes completely out the window. So the only people I've done it with are probably my more proficient lifters, because as soon as you start setting challenges, they'll start then letting that technical proficiency run down. If anybody wants a copy of that, you are more than welcome to it. I shall stop sharing it now.
Great. Can I just ask one point on what you're looking at that? Because
yeah,
I don't know if I missed something, but the way I look at the force velocity curve is I'd use it as not an exercise prescription, but obviously you're going to have your squats at the top, and then you're going to have like your plyometric based work at the bottom, and then you'd put that into your program judged on what you want your athlete to work on. But
absolutely.
I'd never look at it as a way to adapt an exercise. So I'd never try and adapt the snatch to work at the lower end of the curve. I'd always want it to be in that kind of upper section. So if you're going to say from peak to not absolute strength, do you know what I mean? Do you know what I'm saying? So
yeah,
I don't want to utilize it. I don't want to put an exercise into the force velocity curve. I'm going to
expecting it to be
dictate
somewhere
what
else.
I use.
So you prescribe, as you've kind of already gone, you've already kind of answered your question in that sprints are going to be right down the bottom, plyometrics going to be right down the bottom, and then your 1 rep max squat is going to be right up that top left hand side.
Yeah, it's just a point to get to everybody else, but that you're not going to adapt an exercise to fit the curve. The curve
absolutely
is going to dictate what exercises you're using.
Absolutely, and Christian will jump in a second, I'm sure, but I know roughly what speed a 1 rep max back squat will come in at, and a 1 rep max bench will come at. Whether he's got it off the top of his head, I'll be very impressed, but you kind of, I'm sure he will because he's smiling, but roughly where you would see a 1 rep max snatch and clean and jerk would come at. Have you got it?
Yeah, I mean, we were looking at kind of the 0.8 realm, I think, generally for cleans, I think, and around 1.2, I think, for comfortable snatches. It was something like that. But obviously, height dependent was a big thing on the actual athlete themselves.
But how reliable is measuring bar speed for a snatch compared to a squat or a short movement? So there's too many variables within a snatch.
Bench press is even shorter, and it's pretty reliable. I know there's a lot of research on the validity and the reliability of all the kit. Generally, the more expensive kit, so the 3000, the gym aware stuff, is a little bit more accurate than some of it. But I mean, I have Push. I think, is it Beast you've got, Christian?
Yeah. So what we looked at was that Push and Beast are the only real ones you can use for snatch and clean, apart from obviously the expensive kit for the labs. That can just pinpoint the bar. But I'm teaching a guy now that actually is developing the technology that can hopefully do it for weightlifting off your mobile with a very small margin of error. But that's only because technology has just come on in the last 6 months. But I didn't want to bore everybody with VBT because not everyone will have the equipment. But I think it's really important from a programming perspective that coaches are thinking about the visual impact of it anyway. So all the coaches like Andy, Mike, all the old school guys, they all look at the lifter's bar speed anyway. You don't need a tool to tell you if it's moving too slowly. that's something that might take time. So I think it is really important that what Daniel's point with regards to, you never program Snatch to be on that side of the spectrum towards the strength side, is that the reality is that we want it to be as close to that, almost the lowest point that is ideal speed wise, so that we're lifting the most weight, till the point where it drops off the cliff. And I think that's where we start looking at, it's actually, you know, apparent in the Kazakhstan program, apart from the thousands of drugs, that they stopped doing any more than 3 reps because the form breakdown on the bar speed dropped below the point at which was optimal, because obviously the weight they're using is always going to be heavy enough to create the stimulus for power. So I think that's quite an interesting thing when we do look at VBT, that it can really show that actually by the 3rd rep you're not even doing a worthy Olympic lift.
Yeah, most prescriptions for the VBT side of things will have a prescription based upon the speed that you're looking to recruit that musculature for, which is normally going to be somewhere around either absolute or strength speed, certainly for power and weightlifting. But it will have a bracket of, now, for example, I think speed strength for me for a back squat was starting at 0.5 meters per second for a triple, which is going to be around 90%-ish, depending on how I feel and how I'm firing and all that sort of stuff. So it's going to be ended up being, and it will cut off, I'll then look to cut off at about 0.6, and then I'll just change the weight.
Over how long do you measure in order to get your sort of mean velocity on a certain movement?
So if I'm doing a set, I am looking at that set, I'll look at the mean velocity at the end of the set and I'll adjust accordingly. So if, for example, I was doing 6 sets of 3, which should be in theory around 90%, depending on how I'm firing. If the first set I put on, say, for example, 100 kilos, just as an example, which is probably about right. Anyway, so if the max speed there is a little bit slow at 0.45, I then want to be taking a little bit off. So I go down to 95 kilos, and then that rep range is then coming down. So the speed then comes down into between that 0.5 and 0.6. So it's the speed that you work at and the weight. So it stops me from chasing the weight is probably the reason I like it.
But how long a period of time, not just within the session, but over a program, would you measure? So, for example, you could be an explosive lifter, or you could be a sort of lifter that grinds it out. So your speed, in terms of percentage-wise for a rep range, might be quicker naturally to somebody else.
Absolutely.
So how long do you measure that?
It's going to be down to you as a coach, I think, on whether you prioritise to continue working on that absolute strength because you think that that's the priority, or because that's the style of athlete and the fibre types that they're kind of born with, or whether you look to focus on that speed strength side of things to bring their speed back up. Christian, you got anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I was going to say that the practical use of it is the most limiting factor with regards to how long you can use VBT for. So realistically, one, there's no point me making Craig measure his 70%, some volume cycle or anything like that. So we'd be really looking into building it through those, maybe the week before the kind of peak weeks for us to gauge where they're at, and then during the heavier lifts. But I would never let the athlete see their speed on a heavy lift day from the psychological side of things. Be data that I'd be want to using myself. So I really wouldn't use it for a long period. In powerlifting, I think you could, because you could have it set up a lot easier, but for weightlifting, the movements are so difficult for that.
Yeah, it's definitely much easier for powerlifting. So for regulating squat, bench and deadlift, which is predominantly fairly linear as a movement, bar the bench, which is a J curve and a direct bar path back, it's much easier to track that linearly, whereas the speed, depending on the neural capacity, isn't going to be as linear with weightlifting. I prefer it, or I much prefer it on the compound side of things. But for complex movements, it sounds as though actually the software that Christian's mate is looking to develop might actually give us a little bit more data, because if that sort of technology is able to give us some form of 3D mapping of where that bar path is actually traveling, it will give coaches a lot of good data as to how to look at that pattern of movement as well. I'm guessing that's answered your question, Gary, because you've disappeared. I think the other kind of things that we need to kind of look at are things like differences in gender. there's been a lot made out of differences in gender and how you prescribe a lot of things with gender. Actually, this day and age, clearly with supplementation, there is a massive difference, but that gender difference is the same whether they are on any form of gear or not. Stereotypically, women tend to look to or are able to recover from endurance work much more. When most women can recover from more upper body work much better than men. Men tend to recover better from volume, but you also have to take into account that everybody's different. So everybody has different ethnic backgrounds. You have different somatotypes as well. You have different makeups of how your muscle fibers are, and you can manipulate those muscle fibers to an extent as well on whether they are fast twitch and slow twitch. Obviously, you're born with a certain amount, but you can manipulate them as you go through as well. So there's so much that kind of goes through. The only other thing I wanted to kind of mention, I suppose, was the kind of happy athlete side of things. And obviously, it depends on whether this athlete and where they are on that journey. But keeping an athlete happy is probably a main priority as a coach. If you've got a newbie lifter in who is just going to die under the bar doing 3 sets of 10, you might not want to give them that. You might want to give them 4 sets of 8 or 5 sets of 6. The rep range is, or the total rep range, when you look at Prelipin's chart, is very similar. The stimulus is fairly similar. Top end of hypertrophy, lower end of strength, or top end of strength, lower end of hypertrophy. So keeping the athlete happy and making sure that they're enjoying their training is probably the priority. When you look at those athletes, looking at things like Commonwealth Games and things like that, actually that athlete is highly aroused already. They probably don't need to be, they're going to still need to be happy. They probably have more psychological things that they need support with rather than being happy in what their training is. They already know they need to do certain things, and they're probably going to be working with a coach that they have a good relationship with anyway. So actually keeping people happy on a bigger picture thing, certainly from a crazy strength side of things, that's one of the things I like to kind of focus on from a big picture, delivering athletes to the platform so that they've not got anything else going on. Everything else that is going on is by the by, and they're performing well on the platform. I think that kind of brings an end to the discussion, unless anyone else has anything else they'd like to ask.
Craig,
are we doing a part 2 of this, are we?
We'll do as many parts as you want. My plan, I think next week I plan to cover squat, and I will do a chat on just basic mechanics of squat. I'll then look at squat specific to weightlifting and powerlifting and any other questions relating to squat. Those that know me know that I am mildly obsessed with squats anyway. Anything pressing overhead from 4 years of being a powerlifter is my absolute nemesis, but I'll talk squats for days. But I plan to, certainly from a social perspective, I plan to run this every Sunday until lockdown kind of closes. I'm absolutely grateful for any coaches that want to jump on, that want to lend a hand. It's as much a school day for me as it is everyone else. So much appreciated if people do want to come on.
I'd be really keen for a velocity-based session, because I know that's something that's going to be moving forward quite quick.
I think so. In the next couple of years, I think it's going to be a little bit more prevalent. So perhaps Christian and I will bash our heads together at some point and sort out an itinerary for that bad boy.
That'd be mega.
Cool.
I think if anyone is interested, there's an app called My Lift. It's about £4, and that basically measures velocity. It's not going to be as good as the push or the beast scheme, but obviously it's far cheaper, and it can give you some idea into velocity-based training. All you'd need to do is it tells you how to do it, but you'd get a tape measure, you'd measure the range of motion, so it's very specific to you, and then you'd film the lift, and it would tell you a number of things. You can also do things like your force velocity profile on there. So I can't remember, one of you asked about how you would know what part of the strength continuum you would work, whether it would be strength or velocity, and it gives you that sort of breakdown on there to help you out as an individual too.
What was that called, Aaron?
My Lift.
I'll push that out online. Thanks for that, buddy.
No worries.
Pretty good app, to be fair. I think a big thing to note for everybody is that and Aaron's absolutely right. It's a great piece of software, and Christian mentioned about high velocity-based training. It's the way forward. However, just remember what level that needs to be pitched at. Because if you're a beginner, intermediate, novice-based athlete, dare I say that it's probably going to be counterproductive you spending and getting too bogged down into the data and the metrics that are coming out of something like that. Whereas at an elite level, intermediate elite level, that may be quite beneficial if you're involved with a coach that knows what they're talking about and understands the principles of training, understands how to apply that. I think what some people can be at fault of doing is maybe overlooking things. And like we said before, simplicity, adherence, and enjoyment is key, especially with things like weightlifting and powerlifting. So I think a lot of us need to be careful and mindful that, get the apps, they're fantastic, but they don't necessarily give you the whole picture. There are other things that we need to consider and other variables to be mindful of if you are going to do that. All the gear and no idea.
Pretty much sums me up. Any more for anyone?
I just wanted to say about the, I think, I'm not sure how much we touched upon it, but I think from a program, if a lot of you are coaches, probably one of the biggest things I've not paid attention to for certain lifters is the volume growth over the years. So what we've tend to find is that obviously athletes come from different sports. So for example, they might come with a high work capacity. So we chuck them in on maybe a solid weightlifting program, intermediate. Suddenly they hit a plateau where the technique, maybe after 3 or 4 years, is actually quite proficient, but their responsiveness to training starts slowing down. And we can look at loads of other methods like triphasic, blah, blah, blah. But I think the biggest thing for me, and definitely some of the kind of lifters from the 90s and early 2000s, where we started using some more Russian research in Britain, was looking at the volume and the tonnage as a way of really looking at progress for the lifter. So for example, Craig as his Benjamin Button body, as he moves into his 20 years old year, his work capacity should obviously go up, and your programming should obviously respond to that. Because when we do look at the programs from like Medvedev and a lot of the Russian programs, is they over 5 years the volume increase is phenomenal, and it's not really something we look at across the year. We tend to look at it maybe per week or something. And I think it's really something that you guys writing programs is to see that the volume you give your lifters as well as the tonnage is gradually increased over time through a program cycle. And that's, to me, the best way you can ensure progress as well as reducing injury from shocking the body with outrageous amounts of tonnage.
Yeah, it's cool. Which will bring us nicely on to part 2 at some point, where we do daily and weekly undulating and total tonnage. Perfect. Any more?
So,
mega.
Cool. Thanks, Colton. Good to have you here from overseas.
No, I don't mean to prolong the discussion.
No, please do.
But, I kind of wanted to go back and ask a question about points 3 and 5. So I'm working with a couple different para athletes who compete in the para powerlifting organization, and basically all they do is bench press. That's because they don't have use of their legs. And I'm having a hard time I'm curious of all of your collective opinions on this. When you have to use crutches and you're basically using your triceps every single day just to move around, these particular athletes go crazy when I tell them, hey, don't train more than 3 days a week with the actual bench press, because you're literally using your triceps every single day. And they're having a hard time grasping that. Like, is that, I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts on overtraining for them and being able to recover?
I'm going to pass that one directly to Chris, knowing that he has experience in this field already.
Yeah, Colton, I was lucky enough to work with a lot of international powerlifters at my time when I worked at Welsh Weightlifting, and still coach a few now and again. I think the biggest thing you have to take into account in powerlifting is listen to the athlete. A lot of the powerlifters are going to want to push themselves on a daily basis. It might be their only stimulus each day. I think my biggest concern always was with the lifters. Certainly the wheelchair-bound ones was making sure they could still get around and do their day-to-day business. If you weren't tired them out so much that they can't move themselves or transfer from their wheelchair, you pretty much stopped their life. The program has got to reflect their needs as well. But you'll also get a lot of them who will, I'm just obviously generalising, but a lot of the lifters I dealt with want to train exceptionally hard every day as well. So it's finding that balance. But it's a really, really, I would say it's the hardest thing I've ever programmed, para-powerlifting, when you've got potentially someone who can only do, well, they can only do a volley every day. It's a battle, and it's a constant challenge of how you challenge these athletes as well. What's your sort of thoughts on?
Yeah, I'm definitely finding it's the hardest.
Sorry.
But it's definitely the hardest thing that I've done, because I can't, especially because it's all remote programming. I'm not there with them, and so it's extremely difficult for me to figure out kind of the math behind it. Like, how do I get them to hit the numbers that they want? And so, yeah, I appreciate that perspective. You know, I try and listen to what they say, but I mean, in my mind, I'm always, you know, because when you program for traditional powerlifting, there's so many other things you can do. And when you're, like you said, wheelchair bound, like, I mean, how many different times can you do the same thing every week? And so,
I mean, I'll use one of the guys I was coaching who went to the Commonwealth Games. He was 43, 44, and he was training 7-8 times a week because his life was pretty much full-time around lifting or rowing. So he rowed and lifted. But he was an obsessive trainer, but that's pretty much all he had in his life, apart from, you know, day-to-day mundane routine. I also coached a guy who lost, well, two lads who lost both legs in Afghanistan. One was blind in one eye, and he pushed himself to the ultimate limit every day, because that's how he got through every day. So there's lots of I'd say, go back to, were they born with a disability, or have they acquired them as well? Has a difference.
I think that's a difference, isn't it, Chris? That's a
Yeah,
big difference.
I definitely found people who acquired the disability later on in life actually were very different as well to those who had been to be born with a disability. Their movement patterns and everything were different. That was also a concern for me and a consideration. Anything else, Colin, I can help you with there, but we can definitely chat offline as well if you want.
yeah, no, I just, you know, like I said, I feel bad because I don't feel like I'm providing quite enough information for them, and so any perspective just helps me kind of think differently.
The biggest problem you'll have in the para-powerlifting world is there's very, very limited information out there. I attended both of all the 3 courses that World Para-Powerlifting put on, the novice, the elite, and then the international coaching. And that's basically your main source of information you'll find. If you start looking for research on para-powerlifting, there isn't much out there that you can actually tap into. The IOC have put some good documentation out, and the IOC have actually got 2 or 3 really good books on the different conditions that you might deal with, and different stimuluses that you can offer them as well.
Okay.
I'll get the names of them books. I've got them upstairs, but I'll pass them on to Craig to pass to you.
Perfect.
But I'd say the main thing I would say is treat them like any other athlete, where you actually just treat their needs that they've got. Definitely in para-powerlifting, one program doesn't fit all. You've got to fit to their individual needs. And I think from experience, work their back as much as you do their chest. So certainly with their bench press, optimize the back as well, because that's a huge area where a lot of coaches don't think about. They do so much bench because it's the main lift, but don't do enough back.
I think I'll back that up from a powerlifting perspective, from an able-bodied as well. That's very much underestimated. People don't realise that. I mean, it's silly things like the more muscle mass you have on your back, the less you have to bench press. If you get into a good position, it's just silly things like that. But it's certainly for new lifters, it's very much underused from a powerlifting perspective.
Can I jump on? My sort of final take point is, just remember what they've got to do in their day-to-day life as well. So if they are transferring in out of a wheelchair, they can't be so tired that they can't do that, because they might live by themselves and need to get in and out of a wheelchair just to live, basically.
Okay. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Cool.
I think there's wins to be taken from a psychological perspective as well, Colton. I mean, I've got... Oh, sorry. Go on, Glenn.
No, crack on, Dean. I'll jump on after you, mate.
I was just mentioning I've got a amputee who's on a program with me. It's a bit different to powerlifting in terms of he's on a sort of mixed model of training because he just likes to train. But I think Chris alluded to it then. He hasn't been born with that disability. He's unfortunately lost a leg from being on tour in Afghanistan, and that's a completely different mindset that they have. So psychologically, it's kind of a win there because it's a tough one because he wants to do lots of different training, and you have to rein him in a little bit and just say, listen, mate, you are doing like 8,000 or 9,000 steps, 10,000 steps a day with one leg. Like, just put that into consideration, and then look at the load of training that we're doing, the things that you want. Sometimes it has to be reined back in, and psychologically, I've probably found I've had bigger wins there than from a physiological perspective, because I've been able to try and sit down with them and buy them into the process a little bit more, get them to understand what you're trying to achieve with them, rather than thrashing themselves on a daily basis. And you're thinking, Jesus Christ, you did arms yesterday, the day before, now you're doing chest, now you're doing chest, now you're doing chest again.
I think that's where coaching really comes in, though. A lot of people think coaching is just developing programs and reps and sets and just giving people stuff to do, where actually coaching is developing rapport, almost a bit of welfare every now and then, and making sure the athlete is okay. Coaching is it's the bigger picture side of things on top of the stuff that you should be doing. Glenn, crack on, mate.
Yeah, just want to jump on there. I've been lucky enough to coach, well, 3 who are bench only. One is an amputee. The other guy had been to Invictus, and I'd coached him prior to Invictus. And the third one, he's able-bodied, but with injuries, he's limited to bench press only. Still serving. But again, as Chris and Dean had said, yeah, we'll have to look at their daily lives, especially if they are wheelchair bound. The one thing I sort of worked on and I took from our coaching course was, and we've talked about this already, was keeping them interested. I like to throw in a bit of a 3-4 rep max every now and again, every few weeks. And from that, you can cover basically 6 weeks. So they're coming towards a period in the week where they're excited because they're going to test a rep max. And with, for bench only, that could be to a 3 board, to a 5 board. You can vary that. You can add bands if you had to, just something different for them to focus on and get excited about. Once they hit that 3 rep max, the following week, they can do the same exercise at 80%, and then the week after, 85%. Then we're going to drop from a 3 rep max to maybe a 5 rep max to a 3 rep max, and then repeat that percentage. So before you know it, you've covered 6 weeks of programming where they're quite excited because they're hitting a specific goal of a rep max, followed by a percentage the 2 following weeks after that. It's pretty easy, and it gives them something to get excited about. I do that with all of my clients, and I think especially when you're limited to bench only, to have that excitement, it adds a wee bit from the monotonous.
Glenn will know, because it's something that I cover on the workshops that he's been over in shadow, but doing rep max tends to work quite nicely on keeping people stimulated without absolutely maxing them out and fraying them all kind of central nervous system wise. It works really well from reps from kind of 3 till 6. Once you go over 6, generally you lose any kudos in some of the peer-reviewed formulas. The best one I use, have you got a pen, Colton?
Yeah.
I'll unmute you. If you've got a pen, your Epley's peer-reviewed formula from, I think it was 1997, is the weight used multiplied by the reps, multiply by 0.033, and then add the weight back in. Should give you, and I tested this out previously with some reps at, clearly it wasn't a clinical research, but reps at 80, 85, 90, 95, and they all came within about 5 kilos, which is pretty good for what those formulas do. So that's Epley 1997.
Okay. Less than 10 is more efficient, effective, isn't it?
Yeah, as soon as you hit kind of 7 or 8 rep max, that that formula kind of loses any kind of kudos that comes with it, and the accuracy kind of dissipates. So anywhere from, if you go to a 2-rep max, you might as well do a 1-rep max, and you start then overloading people too much and your risk of injury becomes high, and actually you only really want to save that 1-rep max for the platform. So 3s, 4s, 5s and 6s work fairly well. Obviously 5s and 6s you can probably do a little bit more regular because they're still slightly more sub-maximal than doing a 1 or 2-rep max, if that makes sense.
Just make sure you leave 3 reps RPE or reps in reserve, guys.
Very good, very good. Cool. Any more, guys?
I thought that was brilliant.
Perfect. Thank you very much to everyone that's attended. Really appreciate it. Dean, thank you very much for your input as always. Christian, adding more than you probably anticipated, but much appreciated. But I intend to run these 8 o'clock every Sunday now until COVID-19 decides to do one. I just find them a great social. I find them a great way to kind of share the education side of things. It also keeps me busy, keeps me out of trouble, and I love learning as much as the next person. So I will probably look to cover squats next week, and we'll probably then do velocity-based training the week after, before we then maybe do a part 2 version of the programming. Yeah, so yeah, look forward to it next week. Squats. Thank you very much, guys. See you soon.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.
Love you all.
Cheers. Thanks so much.
Cheers, guys. See you later.
Is this that thing where people just want to be the last one standing? The last one clapping.
How many are left? 4 of us.
Jake's the last. I'm saying on
Jake
the
and
chat, if you want to
Jim.
stay, boys, you are more than welcome.
Yeah, that's it. I'm here.
If you're staying on for a reason, if you want to chat about anything else, you're more than welcome. I've got another half an hour yet, so.
Me and Craig are just summarising.
Jim's off. Jake, if you want to chill and chat, mate, you're more than welcome.
Yeah, I'll chill for a little bit. Emma's just drying her hair at the minute, so.
Oh, am I allowed to ask which hair, or?
Then it's movie night. She's only got one set of hair, mate. She's only got one set of hair.
Oh. Right, I think we'll,
Say again.
How was that, buddy? Enjoy it?
Yeah, no, it's really good. Really good. I wanted to join in last week, but I ended up going for a walk on Dartmoor, and then I was out for 22 miles. So I was out there, and I saw 3 people the whole time.
That was your birthday.
So that kind of took over. Yeah, it was, yeah.
Yeah,
so I thought I'll go out to Dartmoor, treat myself, and then ended up going for a lot longer than I expected. So decent.
Happy birthday for last week, dude.
But
thanks very much.